This is Sprint 4 review video for AR Fortress West Point Capstone team. For our agenda today, we're going to go over our product vision, our sprint goal, capacity, the sprint products that we have from this sprint, reflection on our sprint, and plans for future sprints. Our product vision hasn't changed, is still to make a fully functioning app that can display Fort Willis in a fun, interactive way while using augmented reality. Our sprint goal for this sprint is to implement the graphics into our application while continuing to add on the layered learning aspect with text boxes and highlighting functions, and preparing products for the FDR and Projects Day. This is a responsibility matrix for this sprint. It just shows some of the tasks, the underlying tasks that we wanted to complete during this sprint, our primary and alternates for each task, and whether we completed it or not. We were very successful on being able to complete the tasks that we planned for. For our capacities for this sprint, we planned for 123 hours and we completed 117. So as you can see on our burn down chart, we had a big drop off at the end and a very flat line in the middle. That's mainly because of spring break, and then also we didn't do a very good job throughout the sprint of putting in hours, and so we had to put a lot of our hours that we completed towards the end of the sprint.
Throughout this sprint, I worked with our graphic designer to make necessary adjustments to the fort and battery graphics. After meeting with Colonel Jim Johnson, a subject matter expert on the American Revolution, I understood the major changes that needed to be made to the design. We adjusted the epaulements and the parapets around the cannons, changed some of the leveling of the earth inside of the fort, and also made changes to the bomb-proof inside of the fort. Any other adjustments that we want to make in the graphics, I will annotate so that next year's group will know. Further adjustments will be minor, but I want to ensure that the application is as historically accurate as possible. I've worked with the CS team to add in the initial text boxes to the graphics. I send them what I want to have written in the app, and they implement it. The research for the graphics is ongoing so that I can ensure that the app has as much information as possible for the user. This goes into the layered learning part of the app, where the user can explore as little or as much information as they desire for each graphic. We have also worked with the graphic designer in getting the cannon animated so that the user will actually be able to digitally fire the cannon. We have also started preparing the storyboards and quad charts for the upcoming Projects Day. Looking towards Projects Day, it is important that we are prepared for our presentations. We used last year's storyboards as a template and changed them to reflect our project. Once completely finished and reviewed, we will have them printed with plenty of time to spare until Projects Day.
The work that I completed during Sprint 4 was primarily focused on making sure that our objects fit our size constraint that we set in Sprint 3. Our overall test size was 240 megabytes, and this led for about a minute download time. We gave the understanding that within 30% increase of that test size was still within our acceptable range to allow the user to download the app while on site at the visitor center. So far, our actual size currently is at 372 megabytes with the following breakdown. The most alarming thing that stands out right now is that the Colonel's uniform is 132 megabytes, whereas the Matros's uniform is 10 megabytes. The difference here was achieved by optimizing the graphics themselves. There's two ways that we were able to accomplish that. One was by decreasing the actual amount of nodes involved in the graphics, and the other was blending the texture files into one diffuse texture so there's not a whole bunch of redundant texture files within the application itself. Going back to our other objects, a couple of them that have been optimized nicely are the cannon, which is animated, which you've already seen in the sprint video, as well as the musket. So the first object that we were able to optimize nicely was the rifle, and that was primarily because we were able to blend the textures of the rifle into one texture file called a diffuse that incorporated all of the different textures that the rifle would use, and it would map the texture file to the rifle itself. Whereas, for contrast, the fort was already over 100 megabytes. This would be one texture file for the fort that would go on one particular polygon in the fort, rather than creating a diffuse that it could refer back to save space. So this is the work that needs to be done in the future sprints to continue optimizing the graphics within our final product. And to get to this point was actually quite challenging because we were having a lot of issues coming to and from the programs that the developer was using and getting them into Blender and Xcode. I mentioned earlier that the kernel's uniform was about 10 times the size of the Matros uniform, and that's partly because the Saber that you can see now is actually just its own separate object that was placed inside of the kernel's object and was definitely not optimized the same way as like the Matros's uniform was optimized. So it has every individual node still on the Saber. So what we're going to do in the future sprint to mitigate this is to actually take out nodes that do not detract from the actual visual appeal of the Saber in order to mitigate the actual size of the kernel's uniform.
This sprint, Dan and I worked on incorporating the graphics that we acquired from our graphic designer into the app. As you can see, we kept the title page and fort selection page the same as it has been in the previous sprints, so that today we'll be showcasing what the graphics look like. The first graphic we have is the musket, and as you can see, the buttons that you can interact with appear on the side after you've touched the screen. You can still rotate the musket, and a point to highlight for the history folks is that it says United States on the buttstock, which was a feature that we were trying to get them to add. Next is the Matros. You can also scale the objects up as well as spin them around. The next object is the fortress, which takes a little bit longer to load just because of the size of it. This will look different in previous sprints, or in the next sprint that we do. One of the issues that we ran into is some of the objects aren't aligned fully. So when you rotate them, they don't rotate around the axis of the object, and we will be fixing that in the next sprint. Next up is the kernel. As you can see, we added the sword on his side, and his outfit is more textured than the other ones, as well as the lieutenant, who looks similar to the colonel, but with noticeable uniform changes that we will be able to highlight in our layered learning features that we were working on as well during this sprint. This is the cannon as it's shown. You can see that the cannon has a lot more shading and lighting. We will be adding similar lighting features to the other objects in the app in the next sprint video so that they will look as dynamic as the cannon does.
So for the sprint, we also added in a feature that will contribute to the layered learning portion of the app. So I'm gonna showcase you this musket, and we added a kind of like our initial text boxes that we're gonna use for this musket. So as you can see, when you press the text box button, the text box will anchor on to the musket, and then it will rotate with it and it will scale with it. Obviously the location of the text box may not be the most optimal right now while we're working on that, but we'll be adding unique text boxes to each objects.
One of the other major features that we worked on adding was the ability to highlight various nodes in the objects. So you can click on the highlight button on the right hand side of the screen, and the sash on the Matros lights up, making it obvious to the user that this will be a clickable object and hopefully entice them to do that.
Alright, for our GitHub, we kept in track every class and we committed and pulled depending on which version we were working on. Haley and I worked on different things, and we worked on merging our versions together to make it work. So as you can see, we have committed several per week. In our progress in the App Store, we just uploaded our 2.0 yesterday, and it should be available soon. The new version has all the new graphics. It has text boxes accompanying the graphics. Obviously only accompanies one graphics for now. So if you download this right now, you could check out all the different graphics that we implemented.
Looking back on this sprint, the reflections that we came up with mostly included challenges with working with the graphics and incorporating what we got from the graphic designer into our app. We struggled a lot with compatibility, which could have been mitigated by researching exactly which versions we needed him to export from his software that he was working with in order for it to be compatible in Xcode with our software, as well as adjusting the graphics to be the right sizes, not only in terms of the file size in megabytes, but as well as the size of the graphics themselves, which we had to adjust in Xcode afterwards. The integration of the graphics proved to be a hassle as well, because some of the textures were not properly mapped, and we had to go back to the graphic designer in order to get properly mapped textures several times, and optimization in getting the graphic designer to bring the graphic sizes down to our original specifications, even though that we had already specified them with him. The second challenge that we had was obviously working with the graphic designer. We figured out that phone calls and FaceTime proved significantly more effective than texting and emailing him. So that's definitely a method that we will use in the future, and we encourage the group next year to use. And our last reflection is merging versions of our code earlier. We would have definitely benefited from merging our code before spring break rather than after spring break in order to make it just a little bit easier on us. Looking forward into our product roadmap, for next sprint, the final things that we're looking forward to are Projects Day, getting our final update to the App Store, adding in any of the last-minute stakeholder-driven modifications, as well as some of the modified graphics that we're going to get from our graphic designer after those stakeholder modifications have been putting in, and just getting all of our products ready for Projects Day and getting our AAR comments put together and uploaded so that the next group has a lot to work with.